Welcome everyone to Automation Study Group. Today we have speaker Tim Warner. He's going to talk about Azure Blueprints. Many of you know Tim from Plural Sight training and O'Reilly's. Tim made hundreds, if not thousands, of videos. Thank you so much, Tim, for coming to Automation Study Group. Also wanted to give special thanks to Len Volks, who's very involved with community. He's a cloud solution architect who helped to find Tim, as well as a lot of other speakers for our Automation Study Group. And of course, Mike Steers, who you also know from, he's the most frequent speaker for Automation Study Group and also organizer for Automation Study Group. Tim, over to you, please.
Okay, Claudia, thanks a lot. Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to be with all of you. This is, well, I don't want to get off topic. It's a humbling thing, and it's a great thing to be here with you. I was talking with my wife a little bit earlier today, and I said, Sue, it's like this. Normally, when I'm doing tech training to a mixed audience, wherever that audience might be, I'm fine. I'm not nervous. Everything's cool. But I said, imagine you as a graphic artist. You're going to present on Adobe Photoshop. And a lot of the audience has worked on Adobe Photoshop, so it's a different kind of deal. It's awfully great to be here, like I said. Okay, so why are we here? The name of this presentation is Azure Blueprints Quick Start. And I've received a few messages from colleagues and teams about, you sure you want to present on Azure Blueprints? Hold your thought on that. Yes, and there's some very good and interesting reasons why, I think. I figure I'll present about 40 minutes or so. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, curiosities along the way, I'm fine with you unmuting, stopping me in my tracks. I just have one monitor now. I guess I should have said, I've been with Microsoft now about a month, so my work environment isn't fully spec'd out. I'm on one monitor, and I'm normally not on just one monitor. So the reason I say that is I can't do the chat and my screen share simultaneously here. So hopefully, Claudia, if you want to just stop me if there's a question, that's why I'm here. Any questions that you have, I'll entertain those for you. By the way, I work with Docs and Learn, and I'm continuing to do what I love to do most, and that is education and information technology in a Microsoft context. I'm in charge, I'm on teams that are in charge of the Azure governance docs. So my products that I'm overseeing from a docs perspective include Blueprints, and the other ones are Azure management groups, Azure resource graph, and Azure policy. So FYI on that. Specifically, some goals that I have for you in this study session are for you to walk away with a good high-level understanding of Azure Blueprints, the service. Why might it be useful to a customer? What are its main use cases? From an administration perspective or an implementation perspective, what's the high-level workflow for actually using the service? And then what I don't have on this slide, because this is full disclosure, this is an older slide deck that I used for an old presentation. I'm going to make sure to talk about the roadmap for the future because it's very volatile and the ground's actually really soft here with Azure Blueprints. All right. Session materials, if you do want a copy of this slide deck, and I have a couple PowerPoint or PowerShell script files and so on in one of my public GitHub repos. I've got a short link that you should see on the slide right now, timw.info/AZB for Azure Blueprints. Again, it's kind of old, but frankly, Blueprints, you may know this already, hasn't had much of any movement as far as development for quite some time. So the resources that are in that repo are still current. I verified them this morning. Calling it as I see it, right. Okay, I want you to know, just full disclosure and candor here, that my experience with Azure Blueprints, 99% of it was pre-Microsoft. So I was in front of the curtain rather than behind it. And I know I'm not going to discuss NDA stuff in this particular session, but I was an outsider, as it were. And I had so many head-scratching moments wondering, why is it doing this or why is it not doing the other thing? And it feels wonderful, if for no other reason, to now be aboard the mothership and to start getting some clarity and stuff. Oh, so that's why this works. It's been really, really cool. So given that as a context, I have, I think, a pretty good picture of the customer's perspective of Azure Blueprints. So given that, Blueprints isn't under any active development that I see now, and the engineers on that team that I've chatted with a bit have confirmed that. Why? Because it appears that the kernel elements of Blueprints, which I know we haven't yet formally covered yet, we'll do that next, are being replaced by some new, what I think are much more flexible technologies. I will do a demo today on Azure Resource Manager template specs. That's going to be one replacement, I guess, of Blueprints. Another would be what's called deployment stacks. That one I can't really speak to at all because I just opted into the private preview this morning, so I didn't have enough lead time to be able to get my hands on deployment stacks. And although the engineering team has discussed it a little bit, I found one fragment on YouTube, an MVP presentation from Alex Frankel and a couple of their team members where they talked about deployment stacks for just a few minutes. But I didn't get enough info to where I'd feel confident speaking intelligently about it. I probably can speak a tiny bit, but that's it. And then third, we don't want to forget about BICEP, the domain-specific language, or DSL, that makes ARM template development, deployment template development, so much easier and more familiar. Blueprints doesn't support BICEP, so it's kind of a roadblock issue right there. What does this mean as far as this session? Should we just call it a day, an afternoon, a night, an evening right now? I can think of one person who might agree. But no, I'm hoping that you'll leave this session, if nothing else, with a much greater clarity of the picture of roadmaps, its use case, its utility, and what's coming next so you can proactively embrace it and roll with that change in a much more comfortable way and pass on that comfort to your customers, clients, whomever. All right. Okay, a couple more slides and then I'll spend the rest of the time in demo. This is, of course, a picture, a screenshot of the Azure portal, the Blueprints, the Getting Started page. And what I want to draw your attention to, literally, let me see if I can bring up my drawing tools on my Microsoft workstation. Doesn't appear to be working, so why don't I use a slide animation instead? That preview tag, it's been there for years. And I've evangelized Azure Blueprints for a while because, like I said, I think it has some really compelling use to it. But I was like, why is it stuck in public preview? And what does that mean? What does public preview mean to the customer? Well, you probably know that if you look at the Azure preview terms of use, there's this scary language right up at the top of the document. Previews are provided as is with all faults as available and are excluded from SLAs and limited warranty. So the normal party line, correct me if I'm wrong, is public preview, test dev, yeah, but be careful with using it in production because you may be denied if and when you file a service ticket, unless Microsoft tells you otherwise. So that was a head scratcher. Another one is because I've been a Microsoft certification specialist for a long time, there was a window of several months where Blueprints appeared on a couple of the cert exams. It was either the administrator, the AZ-104, the Azure administrator, and or the Azure architect, the AZ-300 series exams, that for a period of time they had that. And I remember I asked Liberty Munson at Worldwide Learning, why is it that your policy is not to include public preview features on the cert exams, but it's there? And her response, this was a year or two ago, it was a while ago, seemed to be, her comment was that it was near enough to GA. So like I said, if I'm feeling this way, I'm sure customers are as well. What are some problem statements that the Blueprints feature, or the Blueprint service rather, attempts to address? Well, one would be the difficulty in tracking deployment, especially, I would say, for companies who haven't yet, their IT teams and their development teams haven't yet adopted a DevOps position, where the developers and the infrastructure folks are working from a common source code repository with or without pipelines and so on. It's too difficult to find out who deployed what when and to ensure consistency in those templates. And then once we've got something deployed, a VNet, a load balancer, virtual machines, how can we protect those resources against accidental or unauthorized modifications? Again, consistency. We have misspelled tags, right? Taxonomic tags issue. We have folks doing deployments and maintaining these deployments who maybe are typing too quickly or conveniently forget to add taxonomic tags to resources. You might be thinking like I am just now at this as we communicate. wait a minute, Azure policy can fix a lot of that. And that's absolutely the case. That's true. In fact, you're going to see in a moment that Azure policy is one of the building blocks of blueprints. We're deploying to unauthorized regions. We're not on top of least privilege access. In other words, we're not being as consistent with role-based access control assignments as we really should. Ultimately, we need more processes. I personally love Microsoft's definition of DevOps. I can't quote it exactly, but if I remember, it's something along the lines of DevOps is the union of people, process, and technologies to deliver value continuously to customers and stakeholders, something like that. So ultimately, we've got this Azure resource called a blueprint that rolls up, I think, 3 or 4 what are called artifacts. One, we can manage resource groups, the normal deployment unit in an Azure subscription. 2, we've got our infrastructure definitions, from something as simple as a virtual network to a fully fleshed out environment, that you can declare it in ARM.json. And unfortunately not bicep with blueprints. That's one of the bleeding edge things here. Role-based access control. We can add that as an artifact to our blueprint definition. And then we have good old Azure policy, where we have those initiatives and those individual built-in policy definitions where we can, for instance, block deployments to unauthorized regions. We can restrict virtual machines, Azure SQL database servers to particular sizes, all those kind of governance what's that term? Guardrails? That's the term I was looking at. So what you see here, I hope, the promise of the blueprint is that we can create an entire landing zone, dev test environment, user acceptance testing environment, production environment as this reusable resource, this reusable, repeatable, consistent resource that has everything all tied up with a nice little bow. You've got the resource group, the policy, the RBAC, and then the infrastructure itself. And so it's meant to give us that consistency and that traceability. And also, there's some integration points with CI/CD platforms like Azure DevOps. I'll mention that at the end of this presentation. All right, so we're thinking of testing this out, kicking the proverbial tires. What is the high level for using Azure Blueprints? What's the main workflow? Well, if you've used Azure Policy, you'll find that blueprints are easier to grasp right off the top, because what you've got is you build your blueprint, and initially it's in a draft state where you and your colleagues can continue to iterate and develop the blueprint until you're ready to publish. When you publish, you give the blueprint a version number. So versioning is something else that's tracked in Azure with that resource. Only published blueprints, I should say, can then be assigned at a management scope. And in Azure Resource Manager, you've got as your usable scopes, the management group, the subscription, and the resource group. And then after that, like anything else in Azure, it's about tracking and auditing and remediation and that kind of stuff, and ongoing maintenance. I want you to understand, if I'm understanding the Azure Blueprints team correctly, the idea is you're going to create your deployment. Let's say it's a VNet with a 3-tier application and load balancer, yada, yada, okay? You've got all of that defined. You've got your permissions in there defined. You've got your Azure policy in there. Everything's all nice. When you make that deployment and you have that situation functional, that virtual network functional, let's say 6 months from now, you need another virtual network. Maybe you're going to lay an Azure route server in there. The idea is that you're not going to go to the VNet and add that subnet in there. No, instead, you're using the blueprint as your base of operations for ongoing lifecycle management. So you would go back to the blueprint and work on a version, edit the artifact, the ARM template. You might add a JSON fragment to add in a new subnet, let's say. And then that assignment or reassignment would then ensure that Azure creates that additional subnet for the VNet, and you go on from there. Let's see, how blueprints protect deployments, right? You may or may not be familiar with the concept of resource locks in Azure. This is where you can apply a do not delete or just a strict read-only lock at a scope. And those are pretty darn powerful when you think about it. The fact that even someone with contributor role-based access cannot modify a lock. It's really either a subscription owner or if you're familiar with the user access administrator special role, yeah, they're pretty potent. You'll find that Blueprints locks, I think, are even more powerful yet because they're manifested as deny locks. And not only that, they reference a security principle that I never knew existed before. You'll see that in the demo in a second. So what are we doing through these mechanisms when we assign a blueprint? We're protecting the environment against modification there instead of in the blueprint. We're controlling updates to the blueprint assignments, right? We have RBAC for the blueprints themselves. You can remove protection by unassigning a blueprint. So that example I gave of a virtual network with a 3-tier application that we just added a subnet to, we can remove, I kind of envision it in my head as like a bubble over a deployment, a protective bubble. And if we unassign the blueprint from that scope, it's not going to delete the resources. They'll still be there, but that deny lock will come off if you added it, and you no longer have that linkage, that protection that the blueprint is offering that deployment. Because the blueprints are versioned, this means that in Azure, you've got that full life cycle. As you're iterating and developing these blueprints from version to version, you might have one version for one environment, another version for another environment, this kind of stuff. And deleting one version doesn't delete them all. It's not a parent-child relationship. You with me? Any questions, comments, anything at this point? Hope I'm not talking too fast for you. As you can see, I've got my trusty espresso here. This isn't my first one today, I have to say. Okay, so let me switch on over to my other monitor here. I'm still getting used to Windows 11. Let me bring up my browser. Hopefully you're seeing, this is the Visual Studio Marketplace. We're not going to start there. We're going to go to the Azure portal. Here's my drawing tools. They were on the wrong monitor. Well, what do you know? Let's jump over to Blueprints here. And again, I give the engineers at Microsoft a whole lot of grace, especially since before coming to Microsoft, I could only just do wild speculation of what was happening inside the company. Not that there's anything dramatic to report that I know of. It's just that this product seems to have been, for whatever reasons, more volatile than others. So, officially, I've heard from colleagues that I think, again, I'm not speaking for Microsoft, I can't, but the colleagues that I've spoken to just today, as a matter of fact, are saying that their guidance is to de-emphasize having customers use blueprints because of their volatile nature, because they're ultimately going to either be replaced by these template specs and these deployment stacks and the bicep format, or what possibly could happen, I don't know for sure, is maybe blueprints will continue, but will embrace those products as modifications. Your speculation on that is as good as mine. And if any of you know, and you're willing to share in the chat if it's not NDA protected information, I'd love to learn as well. Anyway, we'll want to come over here to the left-hand side, and very similarly to how we have in Azure Policy, the definitions and the assignments, we'll go over to Blueprint Definitions, and we'll create a blueprint. And to get us started here, you see that there's a bunch of samples. And you'll notice even furthermore that many of these samples are aligned to various regulatory compliance standards around the world. And what I was pleased to see when I first saw it, the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, those are pretty cool too. So you might actually learn some good stuff, particularly looking at the CAF Foundation and the Migration Landing Zone, just in terms of picking up good proven practices as far as doing a good Azure deployment. Those are nice. Let's see, there's some ISO. The one that I normally use during demos is really simple here. I just grab the basic networking VNet, and this is going to configure a virtual network with one subnet and a network security group. I think that'll be fine for our purposes. Note that we could always start with a blank blueprint as well. But let me start with that basic networking VNet one. I'll give it a name, of course. I'll call it MSFT VNet 1. And then we have a scope. Again, the controls here are very similar to Azure policy. Where does the definition live? And that definition is important because it will be at that location and lower where it's available. For instance, the very top, and you probably know this, I'm not trying to insult anybody's intelligence, please understand. But the very top of the Azure management hierarchy is Azure AD, the tenant root group. Then it looks like I've got a management group that I created. I'm actually going to scope this to my subscription. So I'm going to choose this subscription, and by scoping the blueprint there, that means I will only be able to assign it at that level or below. I'm actually going to assign it even more granularly at the resource group level. So if we proceed next in the Azure portal, we're asked what artifacts do we want to add? And this one is showing us here that at the subscription scope, we've got an entry for a resource group where we can specify a display name, and then this is going to be the actual resource group name that gets deployed. Now, if you're familiar with Azure Resource Manager JSON syntax, you've got the ARM template functions. So if so, this should look familiar. It's using a couple of those functions, concat and parameters. So whatever we provide as a value for the resource name prefix parameter, that will be prepended to -RG, which is fine. I'll leave that. Now, what I want you to see is a pattern here, and this is true for all of the artifact types. You can choose to hard code the value here, or to be more flexible, you could say this value should be specified when the blueprint is assigned. Your mileage may vary, it depends on how automated you want that to be. We also should remember that in Azure Resource Manager, your deployments happen in incremental mode by default, which means that in the example again that I gave about the virtual network, when we reassign that modified blueprint, it's not like anything will necessarily be deleted. If everything that's in that resource group that's defined in your ARM templates, if it's there in the resource group, an incremental says, cool, I'll leave it alone. But if there's something different, like a new subnet, go ahead and create it. So it's a gentler way to do deployments. So that is the resource group, and then it looks like we can add some taxonomic tags if we want to optionally. What do we have within that resource group? We've got two Azure Resource Manager template artifacts, one that's going to create the NSG, the other one that's going to create the VNet. Now, speaking from the customer's perspective, I look at this and I think, wait a minute, I use VS Code with the ARM Tools extension when I do this. And even more to the point, now I use Bicep with the VS Code Bicep extension. This is not a good editing environment, and that's absolutely true. So what I found in practice is that you could, if you're going to do this in the portal, you would have your template file locally and you would upload it or copy and paste it, whatever. But the GUI here does surface the parameters in this interface, where again, you can either hard code the value, or you could say it needs to be specified at deployment time. But yeah, that's a little bit limiting, and it's something that just, again, I'm telling it like I see it in an unfiltered way. I hope that's okay. Your services are no longer required here, Tim. Uh-oh. If I click Add Artifact, we can see that besides the resource group and ARM template artifact, there's two other ones. There's policy assignment and role assignment. So if we go to policy, this is going to enumerate all of our built-in and custom initiative and policy definitions. You see, so I've got some custom ones up here. Normally when we teach policy, we go for, let me go to the built-ins and do, well, something with tags could work maybe. Doesn't really matter, but the idea is you can bring in your initiative, which would be a container that has n number of policies associated with it, that immediately enforce your compliance requirements on this particular blueprint. Lastly, we'll go back to Add Artifact and we'll go to Role Assignment. And this is just where you're pre-populating your access control list. Who's going to be contributor, for example? And we can either, again, set that when the blueprint is assigned, or we can enumerate in our directory and populate it there. And there will be one per. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, I don't know for sure, but maybe you're thinking, well, okay, but I like to do this stuff locally. Can we do this? Is there a PowerShell interface? And then even more to the point, how can we put blueprints on a conveyor belt? That is a CI/CD process. this portal stuff is not necessarily too scalable. And I would agree with that statement for sure. Hang on, I'll address that momentarily. No surprise, I think. All of these artifacts are represented in JavaScript object notation or JSON. So let me go to Save Draft. And as I mentioned before, that's the initial state that your blueprint is in. So it's going to be in my list here. Sometimes you'll find that when you're looking at your definitions, if you don't see it in the list, dollars to donuts, it's because your scope is incorrect. Looks like mine is correct, so I should be able to see it. What did I call it now? Oh, MSFT VNet 1. Here it is. Yeah. So let's select it in the list. And what can we do with it? Well, we can edit the blueprint, we can delete it, or we can publish it, which is what we'll do right now. Publish the blueprint. As I mentioned, only published blueprints can be assigned, and those are given a required version number, optionally some change notes. Okay, published, so far so good. Once a blueprint is published, it's in an assignable state. So I think we're ready to rock here. Let's go to Assign Blueprint. Now, again, speaking from the customer, putting on my customer hat for a second, I remember looking at this blade thinking, wait a minute now, assign? Aren't we doing a deployment here? Okay, it is what it is. I'll call the assignment, I'll leave that alone, that's fine. The location, all right, that's something that you can control with Azure Policy for sure. I'm going to choose my home location. Assuming that you had multiple versions for different environments, this would be an occasion at assignment time for you to choose that version. I had mentioned the locks being potentially very powerful. This is the lock assignment property right here. And notice that by default, the assignment's not locked. And we can do either do not delete or read only. Read only is pretty strict for sure. I'm going to do that just to demo an extreme type case. And then lastly, we have under what security context is Azure going to do this assignment/deployment? And we can use either a system or user assigned managed identity. And now what's that? If you don't know, a managed identity is, I would call it the V2 or the latest way to create a service account, formerly called a service principal in Azure, a non-interactive identity. And system assigned is cool because that way Azure can control the life cycle of it and you don't have to worry about tracking it as such, and deleting it. It says here that if we do a system assigned identity, we're granting the Blueprint service temporary owner access to the subscription so that it can properly deploy. And then check this out. This is smart engineering, in my opinion. We'll automatically remove this access when the Blueprint assignment process is finished. I like that a whole lot. So let's click Assign. Okay, and now we've got, in the case of the resource group, I had that set to, you have to specify that at deployment. I'll call this MSFTRG. What else do we have to fill in here? Oh, that's the name of the blueprint, the resource name prefix. Oh, that's just the prefix. So I'm going to just do MSFT. The resource group name, why is it asking me for a value there? I don't know. I must have misread the JSON. I'm just going to call this RG1, whatever. And we'll see what it ultimately turns out to be, part of iterative development. Asking us the location of the resource group. Here's that contributor. Who are we going to grant the contributor access to? I'm going to grant my own account. Let's see. Here's the tag and value. I'll just call this class PM, whatever. And then we've got the address space for the VNet. So depending upon how you've configured your artifacts, this would be a case of either just click next or fill it in and go. And now we're going to see that that deployment is taking place actively, that assignment/deployment. So we can follow the progress of that in a couple different ways. I think we'll go over to resource groups. And let me do a refresh, and we should see a new one show up before too long that has some kind of wacky name that somewhat resembles the values that I added a moment ago. Come on. And what we're going to want to test once that deployment takes flight and finishes is I want to show you about that deny assignment. And the reason I say that, it's particularly useful from a customer point of view, because If you've done much work with RBAC and Azure, you know that RBAC assignments are strictly cumulative. And so if you run with a case where you've granted too much access at a parent scope, you can't override that with, say, a deny. And if you try to do a deny assignment, what do you get in the output? Something like, at this time, the only Azure service that supports deny assignments is Blueprints. So there you go. Let me do a hard refresh and let's see what's going on here. Hello. Maybe I shouldn't have, maybe I should have stayed back at Blueprints. Let's go back to Blueprints and go to our assigned list and see what's up. While we're waiting for that, in the interest of time, I'll go to VS Code. Let me get a better color theme going on first. Hey, fun fact, if you're like me and you're colorblind, if you load the GitHub color theme from the VS Code gallery, they have some colorblind themes that have made a nice difference for me, actually, being a colorblind person. There's a light colorblind and a dark colorblind. All right, so again, while we're waiting, I wanted to come over into Powershell Land and to answer the question, how can we do this same kind of work with the Azure Blueprint Lifecycle programmatically? You know, this is given that you're going to use blueprints, given what I said caveat-wise about template specs and deployment. You see over on the left in the Explorer, I do have a script on template specs, so we're going to look at that next. But first of all, I want you to see that in terms of Azure Blueprints, the az.blueprint PowerShell module does not come in when you do an install module AZ. You have to get it separately from the PowerShell gallery. So as you can see on line 12, it's just install module az.blueprint. And then what do we have here? Get a reference to the sample. So it looks like on line 15, creating a blueprint from local. Okay, so one option, and this is enumerated in the Azure Blueprint docs. The structure of a blueprint, I think I have some samples in that repo as well, actually. There's a blueprint.json that's kind of an overall manifest of the blueprint definition. It looks almost exactly like an ARM deployment template. And then besides that blueprint, there'll be separate JSON files for the different artifacts. Maybe I don't have a full example. I thought I did. Samples, Path Foundation. Yeah. Unfortunately, the JSON gets pretty ugly with a lot of IDs and stuff with not as much friendly stuff to work with. I've found that it's best to get a sample going in the Azure portal and just download the dadgum thing and modify the JSON files locally rather than try to do the reverse and build everything up from scratch. Because there's also some requirements in terms of scaffolding, the folders and the folder name and all that kind of stuff. So let me go back to Blueprints PS1. So this first bit of code is just showing us how to create a blueprint definition from scratch using PowerShell. There's a commandlet called new AZ blueprint artifact, as you can see here. Again, all those are JSON files. Once you've created all your artifacts, you can send it up to Azure as an not an assignment, but as a published version up into your subscription. And then lastly, you can assign the blueprint to a management scope with new AZ blueprint assignment, just sending the name of, actually that looks like to be a blueprint object. It's one of those cases where, you know, get help can come into play, whether it's blueprint object versus just a string name or something like that. Assignment file, scope, etc. And then there's a remove AZ blueprint assignment for unassigning a blueprint. Okay, fine. The other side of the coin, to download a blueprint from your subscription, looks like on line 40, we're creating a variable to get an object of a specific blueprint version we've got in our subscription. Then the command we want is export AZ blueprint with artifact, and that'll bring that particular version down to your local file system. And then just the opposite, to upload a blueprint version, import AZ blueprint with artifact, sending in the name of the blueprint, what scope you're going to do, subscription, management group, whatever, and then input path where the folder hierarchy, where your JSON files are. I know that's kind of quick and schematic, but there's reasons for that. Like I mentioned before, it's kind of de-emphasized. All right, it's provisioning state failed, which probably explains why we didn't see it in the resource groups played. Let's see here. The template deployment failed because of a policy violation. Oh, okay. Yeah, that policy that I pseudo randomly grabbed must have had some requirement that, darn it, oh well. I can drop back and punt. I've been teaching long enough. So what I'm going to do is model what I was going to show you with that deny assignment. All I was going to do is go into the VNet, and we were going to try to modify or delete something and see the block error. You can't do this because of the blueprint. And I was then going to go over to deny assignments. And you'll see that when you add a lock via a blueprint, it comes in as a deny. And the thing about a deny assignment is that it overrides everything. I don't care if you have a positive role assignment at owner, where you just own the whole thing. Deny will affect even those owners. And as I mentioned earlier, it references a special principle that I'd never seen before. I think it's called all principles or something like that. It seems to be the functional equivalent of the everyone identity in Windows. So, I mean, that's about as broad as you could possibly think of as far as a lock. Very impressive, in my opinion. So that's how I was going to complete that particular thing. So far, so good, I hope. Okay. All right. Now, I'll pause one more moment, take a sip of espresso. Okay. Now, given that Azure Blueprints appears to be de-emphasized, it's not receiving active development at this time, what is coming down the pike as a way to replace it or maybe extend its functionality? That's still TBD. Maybe if I present for you again, which I'd love to do, I'll give you an update based on what I find out. But one of those replacement extensions would be what's called ARM template specs. And so a template spec or a template specification is an Azure resource that references an Azure deployment template. Okay, so let's just dive right in here using Azure PowerShell. We can see on line 4, if we do new AZ template spec, we can give a friendly name to it. For example, I happen to have a JSON template in my working directory. At least, yeah, here it is, called Create VNet, that creates a simple virtual network. And the idea is that you and your team want to have that template available in a place where you can give team members read permission to it, and they can create new deployments based on that template spec without having any further access to that artifact or needing any further access to that artifact. From what Alex Frankel told me this morning, it's not an either or in terms of, is this for businesses that don't have and won't have source code control for their ARM templates, or who don't have or won't have a CI/CD process? And he said, no, it's not either or, it's kind of both and. It's a preference thing. You can continue to keep your ARM templates in source code control, and or you can create template specs, which are tracked Azure resources that exist in a resource group, and you can just spring deployments off of those. We'll actually run this here. So we've got new AZ template spec. VNet spec is what I called it. Again, it takes a version, similarly to how the blueprints have a version. Which resource group are we going to put this in? Do I have a resource group? I'm not sure I have one available. I guess I could put it in this ASP.NET one. How's that? So I'll just go ASP.NET, location, East US, and then very simply, where is the template file? It's in the current directory. I probably should make sure that I'm authenticated into Azure. Let me do a get AZ context real quick. Whoops. Okay, yeah, I'm good with that. So let me right click up here and do a run selection. The term AZ template spec is not recognized as the name of a commit. What in the world? I thought this command was available in PowerShell 7. I'm using 7.2. Let me open up a terminal real quick here. It can drop back and punt. Maybe I don't have a recent enough version of the Azure PowerShell modules. Oh boy, new AZ template spec. Let's just see. Darn it, I don't have it available. This is embarrassing. Well, let's keep on going here. So after this deployment completes, what I'm here to say is that in this resource group, we'll have a new resource that essentially represents that ARM template. How does that help the customer? Check it out. We now, or they now, as long as they have at least read access to that template spec in the resource group, they can now use, for example, new AZ resource group deployment. Instead of a template file or template file URI parameter, template spec ID. What is the ID? This is kind of a painful thing for me, frankly, but it needs the resource ID that goes all the way to that resource. So on line 10, I've created a variable that contains the full resource ID that goes all the way down to that template spec and all the way to that particular version. I'd love a more shorthand, easier way to handle that rather than have to pass a grade, because first of all, you have to get the ID and then use it here. I mean, not an insurmountable problem, of course, just an inconvenience, it seems to me. But this is critical, template spec ID. And as long as we've got read-only access to that resource group and that spec, you're off and running. So you see that? That, I think, is the main value prop. I would say also that there's a secondary value proposition, and that is if any of you had to cross the bridge of where you've got decomposed ARM templates, where you've got several templates, and you don't want to do nesting, because who wants to do that? So you've got links, the linked template. The normal pain point there is that your referenced link templates would normally have to be in a public Git repo, like a GitHub repo. And if not, if they're going to be where they should be in a protected environment like the blob service of a storage account or something, you have to horse around with generating SAS tokens and all of that. It's an overall kind of an inconvenient thing. My understanding, I haven't tested this piece yet, but the ARM template specs make it much, much easier. You can keep your parent and child JSON templates as specs in your resource group, and it makes it really seamless for that linkage to work. There's a clause that you'll need to put in your parent to reference the linked JSON. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it is worlds easier than the way that linked templates work now with the JSON. Now, I don't know offhand what's going on with ARM template specs with working with Bicep, for example. That's to be learned, TBL on my side. Now, is there anything else I want to sweep up about blueprints before I formally open for questions and then we say goodbye or until we meet again? Yeah, probably about the DevOps stuff. How can you put this blueprint lifecycle stuff? You may think as a customer, okay, I'm with you. I like that idea of having our full governance around our environments that we're deploying, but we need to automate this and integrate this in our Azure DevOps project or so on. What is available, if anything, for that? Well, what you'll find is the community comes into play there. So for example, in GitHub, if we go and take a look at the actions library real quick, let's create an empty workflow to start with. Over in the marketplace, if we do a search for Azure Blueprints, I think Neil is a fellow Microsoft colleague, actually. Neil Peterson has some GitHub actions here for creating and automating Azure Blueprints as YAML for GitHub actions. And in Azure DevOps, Neil again comes to the rescue. In the Visual Studio Marketplace, there's an Azure DevOps extension, as you can see here, that contains create blueprint tests, basically the same thing as what the action does. So one alternative would be to use one of these tasks to make it a bit more straightforward to do blueprint creation, maintenance, and assignments. You could just use the az.powershell modules and just run straight old PowerShell in your pipelines. Those are another possibility. Go from there. Very last thing I'll say is you've got Bicep coming down. You've got this template spec idea coming down. And deployment stacks, like I said, I'm really not sure. I'll just be totally candid. What I did to find that YouTube video, what did I do? I did Azure deployment stacks, hit up good old Google. Yeah, here we go. And it brings us to this Microsoft Q&A page discussing the roadmap for Blueprints. And there's a link here called Deployment Stacks Overview. And there's also a video overview of template specs. Template specs is in private preview. So I would encourage you, you can contact me. My alias at Microsoft is Tim Warner. I can put you in touch with the right people, or you can just contact the team to opt in yourself. That's something I'm eagerly anticipating. The specs appears functional now if you have a recent enough version of the PowerShell commands. I think that's where I went wrong. But anyway, that deployment stacks overview, literally the only resource I could find in the world outside of what we've got behind the so-called firewall here at Microsoft, is this snippet of an Azure MVP talk here, and it's very brief. When I think of deployment stack, I think of AWS stacks, how they do that. I don't know how similar this is. I really can't speak any more to it, so I'm not going to. Let me bring up my slides for the close here, if I can figure out how to get from desktop to desktop here. Yeah, that's really it. You know how to find me here at Microsoft. If you're watching this as an external viewer, thank you, first of all. Second of all, as a reminder, the resources there, timw.info, AZB, Twitter, Tech Trainer Tim, web, Tech Trainer Tim. And that's all I have to say about that. Thank you so much. Claudia, back to you. Any questions?